My name's Lisa Pasquale. I'm the technical lead at Retrofit Works. I'm also one of the technical advisors on the Social Homes Demonstrator Fund that's currently running. So I'm supporting a lot of the projects in the north of the country. So this is a quick overview on ensuring compliance for installers, contractors and suppliers. And this is focusing on compliance with PAS 2035 and PAS 2030. Obviously, it's a slightly complex subject, so I'm going to kind of cover it at relatively high level because effectively the way that compliance works for installers, contractors and suppliers is that each individual type of energy efficiency measure is covered under a particular type of scheme, legislation, regulation, and they're all a bit pocketed and separate. So I'm going to cover the overview. So understanding compliance. So the basic framework that we're working within is that absolutely all work needs to comply to UK building regulations. So that might require local authority sign off in some cases. In a lot of cases, it will involve competent person sign off in schemes. So for example, gas safe, any kind of gas appliance whatsoever should be signed off by a gas safe engineer. MCS will generally require, any micro renewables will require an MCS person signing off. So there should always be a competent person scheme identified for any works. Things like ventilation at the moment is covered under the electrical regulations. So that's, I always get the acronym wrong, NIC, EIC, ECI. It's the electrical contractors scheme. I remember all 6 letters that are in it, but not which sequence they go in. The next kind of most important thing for all work to comply under is planning regulations. So you need to be a bit aware of this. So it really does relate to a lot of things around EWI, anything that impacts the visual aspect of the building. This we've run into a few issues with where they're doing EWI with regards to where the windows sit. So within PAS 2035, we do try when we're putting external wall insulation on to shift the windows out into the plane of the insulation. So this will look a bit different than how EWI was previously usually done. So EWI would normally go on and slightly overlap the window frames and leave them where they are in the leaf of the masonry. That creates quite a deep kind of sill on the outside of the property, quite a deep reveal. With PAS 2035, we try and shift it out into the plane of the insulation. So basically the amount of reveal that's currently on the building will be mirrored when basically the surface of the wall moves out with the window. So effectively the reveal doesn't get any deeper, but it does move the window forward. This is something to be quite aware of when you're talking to planners because window positions and stuff like that, they can be quite sensitive around that. And obviously everything should be compliant with health and safety regulations. So that would be your normal kind of CDM processes that should quite regularly be in place. So at the moment in the UK, grant funded work needs to be covered under PAS 2030-2019. So this is a quality management system for each individual measure. So EWI has its own set of requirements within that document. IWI has its own set of requirements. Loft insulation has its own, et cetera, et cetera. So their processes and requirements for quality are set out within those documents. I will say that they can be significantly improved upon. So don't think of this as the best that it can be. It's the bare minimum statutory requirement. That's the way to think about it, is PAS 2030-2019 is the bare minimum statutory requirement to get you over the line for grant funded work. It is not necessarily best practice. So be aware of the difference between that, because with retrofit coordinators being involved, they may push for best practice, which won't necessarily be spelled out in the PAS 2030 requirements. And that's why it's quite important to have a retrofit coordinator involved, because they need to push for best practice as part of their professional responsibilities to Trustmark. So PAS 2030-2019, it does have prerequisites for staff competency as to who the installer should be, what their qualifications and sign-off should be. And any PAS 2030 installer should have a Trustmark membership for that specific scheme. So there is a difference between a Trustmark installer who's PAS 2030 2017 signed off versus 2019. So do be aware that there is a distinction between the two. IBGs, insurance-backed guarantees, are required for a number of measures, and I'll explain that in a little bit more detail later. So PAS 2030 only deals with the individual measures. So how to put wall insulation on, how to put floor insulation on. What PAS 2030 does not deal with is how to coordinate one measure with another. That is covered under PAS 2035. That is the retrofit coordinator's responsibility. It's to make sure that the installations extend such that thermal bridges are resolved, and that is the best practice element that the retrofit coordinator is responsible for. That is the element which is not spelled out in PAS 2030. That's what the retrofit coordinator's professional judgment is required to inform. And this is a very important distinction to understand, especially when you get into building supply chains. So PAS 2035 sets out the process for coordination. So what the retrofit coordinator should be asking for in terms of details from any of the retrofit or system designers, coordinating specifications to make sure that, for example, if you're insulating a building, that the heat system is then sized appropriately to facilitate work efficiently. And this coordination does require very close attention to detail. So a really good example of that is under MCS requirements. MCS installers can only design and size a heat pump system according to the amount of insulation that is physically in situ when they install. And that is a very important distinction to understand, because if the insulation hasn't been completed when they go in and install, they cannot account for it in sizing their heat loss calculations, which means you're going to end up with a heat pump that is significantly larger than it's actually required to be. And if the heat pump is larger than it's required to be, it is going to fundamentally work inefficiently with the newly upgraded fabric. So the sequencing of the work is responsibility of the retrofit coordinator. And in order to ensure that you get maximum efficiency out of these sets of elements, you have to make sure the retrofit coordinator is correctly sequencing the work. Because it does make an impact on things like MCS sign-offs and sizing. It does make a difference in terms of different product warranties. And it is something that a lot of individuals in the industry are not aware of. So it is very easy for someone to accidentally write off a warranty, accidentally install something that is inappropriately sized, just because they didn't understand that one person needed to do their work and complete it before another person could correctly do their work. And that's why sequencing is incredibly important and why it's the responsibility of the retrofit coordinator. So the retrofit coordinator is not the designer. So we set out, so I'm a retrofit coordinator. We set out the scheme of the actual retrofit. We set out the details, the level of coordination that's required. We set out the sequencing. We do a lot of the vetting, but we are not the ones that are physically sitting there drawing details to make sure that they're dimensionally and materially accurate. We check them, but we don't draw them. And that's the responsibility of the designer. So under PAS 2035, in the qualifications appendix, it lays out what the qualifications of the retrofit designer need to be for different paths. So for path A, path B, path C, who those individuals need to be, whether they can be a system designer or whether they need to be a fully independent designer, such as an architect or an architectural technologist. It does require some technical standards over and above building regulations and other published standards. So a really good example of that is under the building regulations, ventilation is currently required to be no worse than it was before the retrofit. Under PAS 2035, the ventilation is required to be upgraded to a worst case scenario for occupancy. So for example, if you've got a 2-bed flat, and in the 2-bed flat, you've got a family of 4, so you've got 2 kids in bunk beds. Under PAS 2035, you are required to upgrade that flat as if it's occupied by all 4 people. Under the building regulations, you would only be required to make sure that there's ventilation sufficient for 3. So it does require a higher level of ventilation than building regulations currently require, and it does require that it be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. So ventilation is one of the most tricky things in past 2035 at the moment. There is not a one-size-fits-all to it. If you tried to go for a one-size-fits-all, you will almost inevitably go for an incredibly expensive system that could just basically massively oversupply ventilation to a property. So you do need to be quite aware of the fact that the old style of project delivery, where all the properties get treated the same, it doesn't fly under PAS 2035. It just can't. That's not the way that the process is set up anymore, which does make building supply chains quite tricky. So building a team, we need good communication. So we need early involvement of contractors and designers. We need really clear milestones of what they're aiming for and when. We need to be 100% clear on the scope of work for all parties. And like I said, the sequencing is incredibly important. So for example, if you've got an MCS installer that's going to bring in heat pumps or something like that, you need to be sitting down and talking to them as you're designing the installation. To make sure that their sequencing works properly, to ask them what level of completion they need to get to such that they correctly size a heat pump, because a heat pump that is incorrectly sized will cost the homeowner quite a lot in inefficiency. So we need to make sure that the teams are reacting to issues. I would actually say we need to be proactively preventing them. So we need good supervision. We need to make sure that there are no unexpected changes of scope once projects are underway, and that you do have correct contingencies in place. So in a lot of cases where you've got retrofits of existing buildings, you're going to have to do some amount of demounting, deconstruction, strip out to basically pull things out, pull things back, to expose either the bare kind of structure of the building to allow it to be insulated, potentially to allow it to be dried, potentially pulling out systems to do rewires or replumbing. And that will create a certain amount of uncertainty, but basically you need to make sure that that uncertainty is well planned for. And we also need to be supporting contractors through the learning process. Ultimately, past 2035 and past 2030, 2019, they're both quite new to the industry. They won't have extensive experience in delivering this, and that's why really good communication is really important. We do need the right attitude on projects. We need people who are open-minded, who are willing to learn, who are willing to change the way that they do things. Like I said, this is a totally new process. So if you've got a team that is willing to basically engage with a new, a better, an improved way of doing things, an improved delivery, an improved assurance to quality, that is the most critical thing you could possibly have to a project. When you've got a team that is dug into, this is how we've always done it, it's worked fine for us, we're not going to change, you're going to run into some really serious problems with past 2030. You won't meet compliance. And ultimately, past 2035 is there to prevent some of the catastrophic failures that we have seen in retrofit before. And I mean, I've gone into a retrofit down in the south of England. It was about 8 years ago, that within a month the houses started turning black on the inside, and it was catastrophic damage to the buildings. And it's really important that we don't ever repeat those mistakes again. We have developed past 2035 to specifically prevent that ever happening. So trying to circumvent it, trying to go back to, well, we always did this stuff and it was fine. I was in a battle with the guys that installed that retrofit 8 years ago for 3 years, and for 3 years, despite the fact that those houses filled with mold, the installers were still telling me we did it the way we always did it and it was fine. It wasn't until a judge said otherwise. So don't rely on we've always done it this way and it's always been fine, because fact of the matter is very few people go back and check. I'm one of the people that goes back and check. That's my job. I've been a post-occupancy evaluator for 15 years. And we want to make sure that we've got long-term involvement from the supply chain, that they are engaged and that they are involved and engaged in basically making sure that the retrofit actually works. And it's again back to that attitude of learning from your mistakes, learning better ways of doing things, being committed to continuous improvement. That is incredibly important to a team. And pricing. Structured, flexible, and this is where retrofit itself can get quite tricky, because things like, say, sizing a heat pump, again, I go back to this one just because it's an issue I'm dealing with quite a lot at the moment. Sometimes we've got systems where we can use quite a lot of the existing, radiators, plumbing and whatnot. Sometimes we have to strip the whole thing out. And it is about making sure we've got pricing that's flexible enough that allows us to do that in a sensible way where the costs are controlled. So developing a technical approach. Under PAS 2035, it must be coordinator-led. It cannot be contractor-led. So you have to have a coordinator that is basically setting out the strategy for the type of retrofit that's being done, the type of works that are being done. Suppliers should not be leading on which properties their technologies and products will be fitted to. The number of times that we've seen retrofit coordinators brought into the schemes way too late, where there's already a supplier on board saying, yep, I can fit this, I can do this, I can do that. And the retrofit coordinator is now in a very compromised position of going, no, I can't fit that insulation to that house. It puts them in a really compromised position. And ultimately that's, on their professional back, is it puts them in the position of either sign it off and keep the client happy or walk away from the job. And that's not a nice position to start from. So any technical approach under PAS 2035 must be coordinator led. Consortia of suppliers should be firmly resisted. And I know this is a common thing with any kind of public tendering for these kinds of grant funded projects. I've seen it a number of times. I've been on a few of them in past years, where consortia of suppliers basically say, right, between your technology and your technology and your technology and our technology, we've got a great solution between us. Let's go find a housing association that'll let us give this a go. Under PAS 2035, you cannot do that. You really put the RC in a very compromised position of going, well, I don't really think these are quite the right products, and they've now got a wall of suppliers standing there going that they're blocking the project. So please be very wary of being approached by consortia of suppliers. I know it's a common thing. I know it's an industry standard thing, but that's the thing that we're trying to change. So coordinators will need to ensure that the sequence of works is such that it has not invalidated any product warranties. And again, this is one of the things where the consortia of suppliers will usually provide you with an out. They will provide you with a way of doing this if you work with all of them at the same time. And this is a problem that we're running into quite a bit. Is that's really not the way that warranties are supposed to be working. It's not supposed to be a little mafia of companies that are supplying. The works just need to be sequenced in a way that they don't invalidate warranties. And that's the retrofit coordinator's job to make sure that those happen in the right process. It should not be the case of, well, if you buy from all 5 of us at the same time, we'll just make sure all our warranties line up. Don't worry about that. That's not how it's supposed to work. So a really good example of that is core drilling to install ventilation. A lot of the standard warranties from wall insulation suppliers will invalidate their warranties if you do that in the wrong sequence. So they need to be attentive to that. Same with some of the wall installations and installing heat pumps, and this is one that we've run into a number of times. In some cases, the heat pump installer needs to pre-drill, put the pipes through the wall, let the EWI go ahead so that the penetrations are already there, and then come back and fit and size the system once the installation is in situ so that they can sign it off and it's been correctly sized. And that's that kind of sequencing that needs to be done properly and that the retrofit coordinator needs to oversee. Who needs what qualifications? So installers, the requirements are generally bottom up. So the individual doing the job must be approved as competent under the relevant scheme. And again, it depends on which scheme as to what qualifications they require. A supervisor or a main contractor with the qualifications does not suffice. So just because the dude sitting in the office looking at the site pictures has their qualification does not mean that's allowed. It needs to be the guy with the boots on the ground. You need to be aware of ensuring that the individual signing off the work is in fact the individual that showed up to do the work. So we need to match the signature to the face to the qualification. Again, a project that will not be named, we have found forgeries under a number of schemes, and the fact of the matter is we have found forgeries under schemes where the work is then in breach of health and safety regulations because it was not an approved person that did it. And when we took, basically, we saw the works that didn't really look quite right to us. We were like, right, who signed this off? We look up their number. Sure enough, they're under the scheme. They've got their number, they've got their face, and all of that's kind of, you know, public record on the various schemes databases. And we literally pulled up the picture, showed it to the homeowner, and said, "Is this the guy that did your install?" And they said, "No, it wasn't that guy." And we phoned that guy up and said, "Did you do this install at such and such a house on such and such a date?" And he goes, "No, I was halfway across the country when that happened." He goes, I was working in a completely different city. We do find that, and we do find it more often than you would think. That is effectively fraud. That is quite serious. You do need to be very careful about making sure that the individuals doing the work are the individuals that are qualified and signed off to do it. And again, having a retrofit coordinator that knows what to look for when they go back out on site and look at this and say, no, there's no way a qualified person did this. For me, anything to do with pipe work, I see a bad weld, I guarantee you it wasn't a plumber that did it. It wasn't a gas safe engineer. It wasn't an MCS installer. I can spot a bad weld from about a mile away. And so I see a bad weld. The first thing I do is haul up their qualifications, haul up their picture. Is this the guy that showed up at your house? And if it's not them, they're gone. And that's the level of quality control that you need to be looking for from a retrofit coordinator. So suppliers. Suppliers have system-based requirements, and this is laid out in PAS 2030, 2019 in the individual appendices for each measure. So for installation measures, generally it's a BBA certificate with the correct insurance-backed guarantee. So the warranties and guarantees have to be in line with Trustmark requirements. For MCS or gas safe, those are generally for any mechanical system. Sorry, I should have added the electrical installer scheme to that as well. So that would be for any ventilation scheme. And again, that's the NIC, EIC. It's the 6 acronyms, 6 letters I can never remember the right sequence of. With designers, it's the individual that requires the qualifications. So with system designers, that's adequate for Path A and B under PAS 2035. Path C requires designers with named qualifications, and they are individuals. So generally that's a SIPC designer, a REBA architect or registered architect, a CIAT architectural technologist. So you need individuals with the correct level of qualification in order to produce a design for specific levels of retrofit. And again, that's down to the fact that the details are about the complexity of joining up measures and ensuring that things like thermal bridges are resolved. So they will be required for things like making sure that the EWI returns around reveals in the correct way, matches up with the windows, matches up with the loft insulation in the correct way, in the floor insulation, etc., etc. So you need to make sure that all those details are correctly coordinated. It's the retrofit designer's responsibility to actually physically produce those details. It's the retrofit coordinator's job to check them and make sure that they are adequate and that they are well evidenced in terms of making sure that the thermal bridges are resolved. So what consumer protections are required? Under Trustmark, there's a 2-year IBG required for all measures except cavity wall insulation, solid wall insulation, which includes internal and external, park home, underfloor, room and roof. They all currently require a 25-year IBG. There are currently a limited number of products on the market or systems with that level of financial protection, specifically in regards to IWI and room and roof. So just be aware of that. that you've only got a limited number of options in a couple of cases. And again, this is one of those things where the consortia of suppliers might look like a really appealing option because they're giving you a sort of prefabricated set of measures that meet with trustmark requirements. But the fact of the matter is, those are not necessarily the correct set of measures for that particular building, and you need to just be really wary of that. Be keenly aware of the terms of cover of any of those warranties and guarantees. Again, things like core drilling, in a lot of cases, will invalidate certain warranties, so just be mindful of that. And that is my overview as best I can do, which is half an hour long instead of 15 minutes.